about and what came to as far as the SONA is concerned. And I'm sure Hector and many other people, we will talk about it next week. A lot of analysts and a lot of people have kind of, been feeling that the account that the president was trying to put was a 30-year account.
Yes, it was.
Instead
of
a
yeah,
instead of a 5-year account. That, since he had given us Tumamina and how that Tumamina has been in the last 5 years. So, and which
that was my expectation as well, because now we're given a roundup of the 30 years, which is a lot has happened in 30 years. And a lot, there was, although it was the same party, but there were different leaders across the board that came, to be presidents. So the Tumamina, because when he came in, we're like hyped up that, there's a new president in town. And we're like, basically, we're going to be seeing flying cars by now type of hype, and no load shedding. So I think there's a lot that has dampened Tumamina strategy, or
people's spirits.
People's spirits have been really dampened. I think, apart from unemployment, the load shedding that has affected a lot of companies and organizations. And also in investors as well, because they are unsure, they're uncertain when it comes to. But I think with the what you call alternative power producers, that kind of gives us some hope, on
what we are going to
on what we're going to see, moving further. So when he does come back, we want to see firecrackers from day one. We don't want excuses. We just want to see hitting the ground running and radical changes. Basically, that's what we want to see. That's what we want to see now. Now he's what is it? Cultivating uhlakulel?
Yeah.
Yes. So ngoku it's time to
really get down
to it. Yeah. So yes.
Okay, guys,
that's the expectation.
We are waiting on our guest, and I'll just play just a jingle in the meantime. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I'm seeing Sfiso here. He's already joined us on the Sfiso. I don't know if you can hear us.
Let's try again, please.
Can you hear me, But?
Yes, I can hear you. Thanks, But.
Yeah. No, I can hear you clearly. Ladies and gentlemen, Sfiso Skenjana is here, and Sfiso Skenjana is one of the brilliant minds as corner in the country at the moment, and we thought that we'll pick his brain on the SONA, basically what happened, and everyone heard on Thursday as the president was speaking. He's an economist, he's a strategist, policy advisor, a researcher, conference speaker, and apparently you are a retired broadcaster.
Yeah, for my previous sins, I used to anchor the business show on Power FM.
On Power FM, wow! I didn't know, but I didn't know. I saw this as I was going through your resume, which I believe that is also not finished. There's quite a lot that you've done and you continue to do at the moment. But thank you, man, for coming through. And this is Keith Ngesi Radio, and we do this. My colleague here, Spooky, next to me, we do this every Sunday from 3 to 6. So we thought of you actually to give us, and also I may disclose Mudlamini spoke, but of course, on the other side of Mudlamini was Sibalkulu. Sibalkulu, I hope your weekend is okay, but.
No, thank you for having us, and greetings to you and the listeners. Yeah, it's.
Sfiso, are you there? You got cut off a little bit. Hello, Sfiso. Something happened there, ladies and gentlemen. We'll just do a jingle. Sfiso, can you hear us? Hi, Sfiso, are you there?
I'm there. Can you hear
Hello.
me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Can hear you now. We got cut off there a little bit.
Oh, no, I was saying, yeah, no, it's been a good weekend. Thank you very much. And yeah, looking forward to having the chat, of course, with you guys. It was quite a busy week. And so really looking forward to a little bit of quiet during the weekend. And so, yeah, it's been very much welcome.
Yeah. No, thanks, Sfiso, for joining us. I mean, of course, the big thing that happened this week is obviously the SONA and, the lot of things that people have been talking about as far as the SONA is concerned. A lot of people have been unhappy with the president, just kind of recapping on the 30 years, basically. But we'll go into that in terms of whether the fact that he was talking about the 30 years and not about his actual, term, as it were. But what did you think of the SONA, basically, the overall sort of process around what was said on Thursday?
Sure. I mean, I think it's the 30 years is not inconsequential. And I think it's not it's a part of a conversation I think that we shouldn't necessarily shut down. I think it does remind us on some of the gains that we have made over the time. And so I think there were two conversations that needed to be had in that State of the Nation address. It is a reflection and understanding then which part of the growth and progress that we've made that is still under threat. And I think and so when you talk about, for example, the stats around poverty lines in South Africa, as much as that number has dropped from 79% in 1994 to 55% of people living beneath the food poverty line, that's still an unacceptable number. And so, as much as that is progress, those are some of the things, I guess, the language for me that would be exciting to say, these are the things that we are thinking about in ensuring that we move that poverty number from 55% to 20% in the next 5 years, using these and these and these approaches that we think. So I think the reflection of the 30 years, I think, was a missed opportunity in looking at particularly some of the areas that remain vulnerable and saying these are the programs that we think are going to help us solve those things. And then move into a conversation of a government of today, because the SONA is talking about a today context, an experienced and a lived experience for Abantu in a today context. Is the government of today answering and solving for people's problems? When the president, for example, talks about state capture as something that has been eroding at the quality of our institutions, yet the state capture is at the very core of the leading party and government. And so those are some of the things that for me were not addressed adequately in the context of a today government. And so it was too heavy on a yesteryear type of government.
Yeah.
And I think rightly so, people are a little bit frustrated around also the sense of detachment or aloofness that our president seems to have around the real lived experiences of people on the ground. And so Utinzwalo became the joke. Because even in sharing her story and celebrating the story, it was really showing that he doesn't understand what a really progressive economic agent ought to look like. Utinzwalo is still a person who's not even able to express themselves, in the way in which our Bill of Rights and Constitution ought to give you space to express yourself. And so even then, that analogy that he was trying to use, I think, was a massive fail. And certainly, I think on balance, I think it was an incredibly disappointing State of the Nation address. It was used as a politicking ground as well. And, what I always find interesting is how when it suits the ruling party is that then they are government, and when it suits them, they are just the ruling party. And so they really, I think, also cross those lines interchangeably sometimes. And I think that's also something that we ought to talk about in terms of what's the difference between a ruling party and government, which I think, occupy very different spaces.
Yeah. Look, I mean, the part of the sort of what people are taking, and of course, I mean, what the president had said, let alone the opposition parties, because opposition parties will always be oppositionist. But in terms of the general sort of, South Africans on the ground who kind of feel also the very same around the aloofness and out of touch with the reality on the ground. But in terms of people say numbers don't lie. Do you think that the numbers in itself, as expressed, there was a lot of numbers that he put out there, and we know even the metric 82.9, something to be celebrated, but knowing as well that there had been some things that have been done in order for us to be able to get to. Do you think that those numbers that were generally quoted by the president are a true reflection of the progress, or the progress could have been better had things like the state capture and all of those things not taken place, as it were, or even the policies that are there, which sometimes are good, but there is no implementation that comes. So those numbers versus the current sort of setup, and whether or not we could have been better had the government had taken proper steps in implementing some of the stuff.
Yeah, I think the conversation about numbers is always an interesting one, because, of course, which numbers do you use and why? I think is an important question to ask. The numbers that I think matter to me are numbers that answer meaningfully issues around development and human development. And there's a Human Development Index, for example, that the World Bank publishes that gives you all of kind of the variables that one would be of interest. And so the first number I would share with the listeners, for example, is that in economics, there's a term we use called the half-life gap. And that says, how long would it take for Umdu, who comes out of the lowest earning quintile household, to make it into the highest earning quintile? In South Africa, that number is 22.5 years. And so that tells you, in essence, so that's the first number. I'll tell you why it's an interesting number for me. It says that structurally, we have not set up the things that will enable upward mobility for people who come from poor and destitute environments. That also expresses itself in the number when you look at unemployment and you say, where do the people who are long-term unemployed come? And so those are people who've been job seeking for longer than 12 months. Most of the people who are long-term unemployed come from the lowest earning households. And so again, it means that if you are so unfortunate to come from a low earning household, already your chances of making it out of that space, as it is in this country, are close to minimal. And so when we then talk about what are these development indices, there's, again, what we study when we study poverty studies is what we call multidimensional poverty. And it looks at kind of developmental indicators that help you out of poverty through 5 lenses. One is nutrition. And then you look at the state of nutrition. During 2020, government was even taken to court for ending nutrition program Yabanran. You look at health, we're not even going to get into that particular conversation. You look at education. In South Africa, particularly around COVID, there was a study that came out that showed, for example, that kids who had access to internet and stable internet already outpaced, in terms of their long-term growth expectations, the other kids by 1.5 years. And so already it's increasing the context from an inequality point of view, from an education point of view. To that extent as well, when you look at unemployment, 91% of the people who are unemployed have a matric or less. And so when we are talking about these statistics, and then when you look at, again, when we're looking at multi-dimensional poverty, there's also a measure there that looks at social and upward mobility. And so these are the numbers that then speak to the people. The other number that speaks to the people is, what do things cost you? When we read the current inflation numbers, I've had Untat Deresenga Maluleke on my show as well, asking him specifically, is the inflation basket reflective of the cost expenditure exposure of ordinary South Africans? And the truth is that it's not. And so transport is not reflecting there as big a component as it ought to be. Administered prices, food inflation, these are all the things that government is actually in control of. And so when you look at the cost exposure and the inflation price rising exposure of ordinary people, they're all coming from things that government has control over. And so even my inflation numbers and we read them, we read in between those lines, because that's not the number that reflects ordinary South Africans. And they say, yeah, we will reweight the basket in time. We are still collecting new data. But the point is that then when we use statistics, we must then use really good statistics. And so these are some of the statistics that I'm sharing that for me matter, is because they speak to the plight of the ordinary person and the developmental pathway. And none of the things President Aitetsile around that for me are meaningful. And specifically, I mean, if I can continue around that particular conversation, of development pathways. In South Africa, I often say that we've got the labor force that we wish we had. We're creating jobs for the labor force we wish we had, and not for the labor force we currently have. And so then in the studies that we do, which is called structural transformation, what part of your economy must serve the labor force that you currently have? So if 76% of your people are semi-skilled and unskilled, there's no way then that a financial services sector is the largest now contributing sector by GDP. It means there's no strategy for creating good pathways for people to grow. And therefore, then only the kind of highly skilled people will be able to be progressive economic agents and economic participants. And so for me, those are the statistics that matter, the statistics that talk to the person, that talk to their prospects for growth and development, and then ensuring that the institutions around those developmental pathways are sound. And I think that's the part that for me continues to be lacking in our government of today.
And I mean so important what you're saying, because part of what we're seeing in terms of the increment or increase in the students that have actually come out of university, who have degrees and all of that, and their lack of actual employment because the system is not aligning as it should. The system, the education system continues to create graduates which are not aligned with the current sort of environment economically and the sort of active institutions or industries, in fact, where these people, when they come out there, they don't know where to go because some of the institutions are not aligned with what they were doing. Now, of course, I mean, the president, and the governing party will always try and speak, as you say, what they think is relevant for them in terms of the numbers and the lookout, as it were. Part of what the president also came up and spoke about, which a lot of people, had also been humping on, is the idea of the elections that is coming now and them coming back. And also, of course, we know that there's a lot of what's the word? A lot of people are thinking that, there's going to be a government that will be comprised of different parties in the next sort of coming governance. Do you think, looking at what we have and how people are feeling on the ground, that there's a possibility of that, or that the ANC will actually, move into the next administration, the seventh one, as it were?
No, I mean, I think the ANC is probably going to stay in power. We're probably, some of the modeling we're doing, we're seeing them somewhere between 46 and 43%. So I think they'll stay in power. I think what's going to be quite interesting is then what that will mean from a coalition point of view. So they'll be in power, but they'll require still to govern through a coalition model. And that's quite an interesting one, because of course everyone keeps talking about how coalitions don't work. And even in that conversation, I always say, well, it depends what lens you're using. When we first had 3 municipalities that were hung, and that was, I think, Nelson Mandela, it was Tshwane or Ekurhuleni, one of them, and then Gauteng. What we found is that within the first 6 months, there was something close to 300 cases of fraud, of theft, etc., that were submitted to the SIU. So by Aqalana, when there's
Yeah.
coalition. So no one wants the other one to eat. And so, which is good because it's improving the context of governance. And so let then the coalition process also be a way in which we weed out, I think, some of the rotten pieces in how we do government. So I think that's one of the things from a coalition point of view. The other countries who've done coalitions really well, and so also, case studies are out there that coalitions aren't inherently a problematic thing. It's only in how your political structure is set up in a way in which then it can either make coalitions problematic or not. One of the
Yeah.
things, and just to close on the coalitions, there's an entire body of literature in economics called ethnic and linguistic fractionalization, and in short, we call it ALF. But it talks about how when you've got a society that is as diverse as South Africa, for example, policy coherence becomes quite challenging. And
Yeah.
so it's difficult to find a meeting of mind in a very diverse society, whereas in other societies where they're a lot more homogenous or they're quite similar as a people, then they're a lot more able to get to a point of progressive policy making. What that means is actually is that what the ANC proposed around the district development model, that then actually gives it real potential to have weight, because when you're designing policy at a district level, people are a lot more homogenous or a lot more the same. And so I think at a national level, the coalition story is going to be an ongoing thing. But I think what's going to be quite interesting is that how does that channel into how we then do the district model? And at a district level, you are able to find a lot more consensus. And I think even their coalitions can actually be a lot more productive. And so I think ideologically they're going to be disruptive, but I think there's definitely opportunity for a coalition model, I think, to work for South Africa as an interim measure. I think while we try to figure out what kind of political leaders can actually really invest and strategically optimize in terms of where we're supposed to go as a country. But I think we're probably going into another 10 years of coalition government in terms of what we are modeling on our side.
Yeah. I mean, my second last question, Sfiso, the 39% of mining is owned by, is that true? Because that's one of the numbers that has been contested quite a lot. President said there's 39% of black ownership in mining space.
No, it depends what we say ownership is, right? And so if we're talking about shares and these and all these PE deals that they've done, that number can easily look like that. I think when we're talking about real ownership, it's for me is an environment where there's equitable value sharing, and there's definitely not happening in the mining space. Number two, how much does the mining sector contribute to our GDP? It's less than 4%. So you can't boast about a sector that's only contributing less than 4% having some level of what you call it progressive transformation, when the rest of the economy that is supposed to be also contributing to jobs growth or accretion is not actually performing at the level which they should be from a transformation point of view. And so go to the other sectors and see what's the level of transformation in the financial services sector, largest. If you go to transport, what's the level of transformation there? You go to, all the other sectors that are actually meaningful contributors. And so I think, again, is that, if we're going to make a storm in a teacup about transformation that is only based on what I'll call it the visible transformation, but nothing on the floor. If you go, and I mean, there's some work I've done with one of the mining companies, and you look at what the enterprise supply development programs look like, you'll start to see how untransformed the mining space is. Who sells the nuts and bolts to the miners? You start to see those are largely, historically family-owned white businesses. And so that's where the transformation is not taking place. And so when we are talking about transformation, we mustn't just throw, I think, casual numbers about ownership when we're not seeing that translating into equitable value share. And so certainly for me, that's not a statistics that excites me in any meaningful way.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, the part of what I think, I want to ask you, you sitting with the president or the current sort of governing party, and you are now about to start, let's say, the seventh term, which will be the seventh administration. What would you advise, the government to kind of look at? And of course, I mean, one of the things that I think was meaningful in terms of what we were saying is that most of the stuff, and I know that, for instance, Lisicha Khanyago, that space, I always kind of fail to understand that positioning as far as that monetary policy is concerned, that is being utilized to actually make the decisions that they make. But in general, when you look at the state of where we are as South Africa, and you were now to sit down with whether the DA wins or any government that's about to take place now again, and take position, how would you sort of look at the next administration, how they should actually handle most of the problematic areas? We know there are lots of them. I mean, the economy is not in the right place. The crime rate, is also not where it should be. That also affects the economy. And of course, I mean, unemployment, there's lots of spaces where the gaps are large. And for us to actually fill those gaps is going to take an extraordinary kind of leadership and governance in order for us to actually be able to move right along and plug those gaps. So what would you say is one of the most fundamentals to look into?
I mean, I think and this is a conversation I think that at least is starting to echo in some of the chambers in Parliament. There was a time we had a sitting with members of the legislature in Parliament when we were talking specifically about budget appropriation. And simply, we are in an environment where we have to decide that when you've got R1, how do you decide where to spend that R1 between a school and a hospital, for example? Both have got value, but at a point in time, you've got to have a view around which one will give you the most impact. And this is what we talk about around an impact-based budget appropriation process. And so the first thing for me would then to take that lens and say, of all the things that are on our spending basket, or what is the impact quotient, or what is the impact number that is associated with that? And therefore already shows that now we're gunning for the thing that will give us the biggest bang for our limited buck at this point in time. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is really taking a sector-based view in terms of strategic thinking, and say, just like China does, say for the next 5 years, one of the big sectors we're going to focus on is mining, let's say. And this is the investment program that will be associated with that. This is the infrastructure program, etc. And for that 5 years, that sector is the primary focus of government in terms of growing it, ensuring that then it is a labor-intensive participatory sector as well, and all of those things. So the sector-based kind of programs, I think, is the second thing that I would ask them, because then it would really help us focus on one, sectors that are not generating as much value as they have potential to, and really then garner and move, all the energy towards propping up those sectors. The third thing that I definitely would have a conversation with government is certainly around when we look at the things that make people grow, what are the things that make people grow? Which is what I was talking about earlier, is all the human development indicators. That's got to be the thing in which we target our efforts. And we've got to then give ourselves a scorecard around, are people growing along these elements, these variables? Have we measured the extent of people's upward mobility, etc.? In a context where, for example, minimum wage is now 4,400, yet a living wage is 7,700. And then you've got all these people who what we call working poor. So they're working, but their money never lasts them to the end of the month. Those people are not going to grow. And they're going to spiral themselves into debt, etc., because the enforcement of minimum wage is poor in South Africa. I think it's the number, something like 89% of the companies aren't even compliant with minimum wage. How are they even going to get these people to their living wage? And so there is an enforcement around labor-based compliance, I think, that needs to be emphasized as well. And so there's a lot of things that are put in place but are not enforced. And so one of the other things I would say to government is that you've really got to strengthen your enforcement institutions. That then includes policing and all of those things. And so I think those are, for me, some of the priority things that, are actually pretty much low-hanging fruit. They're not talking big, 20-year goals. They're talking about transformation we could see in 5 years. And that, for me, I think would be a very valuable approach to be taken by whoever then is, leading a new administration of government post-elections.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, there's hope for us if we were to kind of allow, the space, the government were to open up space as well for private players to play a meaningful role. And I know, for instance, the enforcement of, the minimum wage is also very, very much problematic. I mean, I've seen it and I've experienced it with my own eyes, particularly with the Department of Labor is not really doing the job that they're supposed to do, especially if you look at the foreign-owned shops and all of that. In general, the inspection is not happening as it should. So I think a lot of the enforcement part, in terms of also just the general policies that we have currently as the government, there is a big lack in enforcement and making sure that it aligns and it works, the implementation is proper, and also there is monitoring that happens thereafter, and which I think that's also not happening as it should. We all, holding thumbs up, and we know that it's 15 days before we actually hear the elections to come. And when they said 15 days from the day of the SONA, so we await to hear when the elections are coming. But are you happy, or looking forward? And I think that's another thing that's coming in the next when is it spoken, on the 26th or 28th? Of this month, everyone is looking to the budget speech now. What do you think that's going to look like? Looking at the
nothing new from the budget. I mean, I think it's going to be the similar story. I will be in Cape Town for the budget, but I think it's going to be around SOEs. How much support we're putting behind Transnet and Eskom specifically. They're not going to touch the wage conversation at all, the public sector wage. Because of course that puts them in a very negative position from a politicking point of view. So I think they're going to skirt right past that. I think they're going to emphasize public spending, or social spending rather. And so there's going to be a big emphasis around social spending. I think they're bringing back the conversations around a universal basic income grant. I mean, that's stuff that was researched as early as 2003 through the De Villiers Commission. And so I don't know why we keep trying to answer something we've already answered. And so they must just get on with it. I think that social spending is going to come back as a conversation that reiterates their commitment to supporting the social context in South Africa. And outside of that, I think it's really then going to be around. I heard conversation around a municipal infrastructure and municipal capacity building program. I don't think they're going to talk about how it's going to be funded and who or when or how it's going to be capacitated, but I think it's something they're going to mention as something that is on their radar, that they need to start looking for money to capacitate municipalities at this point in time. I think those are probably going to be the big conversations, but we're not going to have big policy-based type shifts from a taxation point of view. I think as much as there are threats that seem to be kind of circulating around, increasing the personal income tax brackets, I don't know if that will be their position at this point in time, particularly because of what it'll mean politically for them. So I don't think there are going to be changes from a taxation point of view. I think brackets will be adjusted for inflation as they usually do. But I think they might tee up that it's still not off the table in terms of looking at a more progressive taxation regime, but I don't think any new tax proposals are going to come through. Certain taxes, of course, are always a subject, and so all the guys who have a good time over the weekend are certainly going to expect prices to come up for cigarettes, for whiskeys, for beers, etc. All of those
Yeah.
are definitely sugar. Has also been emerging as a space for progressive taxation. I think that's going to come
Yeah.
through as well. Sugary drinks, as you will remember, none of the drinks that we usually have taste the same anymore because of the introduction of the sugary tax about 2
Yeah.
years ago. So those are
Mm.
some of the things that are going to come through from the budget speech in the context of that. I don't think the SDR grant is going away. That will remain funded through that, and then I think those are probably, on balance, the some of the pieces that will come from Minister Kotongwane when he
Yeah.
addresses us towards the end of this month.
No. Thanks, Sifiso, for that. I think at some stage we'll need to, speak on the monetary policy, because I know myself and Spoky really not happy with, this that gentleman called.
No, we definitely need to.
Yeah.
That's a whale in and of itself.
Yeah, because I mean, of the fact that there's quite a lot of other factors and aspects. They seem to be, for me, one track mind in terms of how they look at the economy, and they just follow that policy to the T. But yeah, I think it's something to worth looking into, discussing, when we find time again. But yeah, I really would like to kind of thank you for coming through and for having this informative discussion around the SONA, and also what could be, if things are done properly. And I think that's one of the major things that everyone, most of the people who are progressive in this country, they feel that if things were to be done properly, we could have a much more better and meaningful sort of South Africa than we have currently. And how also, I mean, strangely enough, the whole thing of state capture, he speaks as though he was not part of that government, that actually made all of that mess. So, but yeah, those are something to sort of look forward to in terms of discussions later on. But thank you so much, Buta. I don't know if you have any other thing to say on your side.
No, all good on my side, but and certainly I think lots more to unpack in terms of really, I think, getting into the nuts and bolts about the things that could really be useful in moving us forward as a country. But thank you very much for having me on.
Yeah, thank you, Boot, and we'll listen a lot, and have a beautiful evening. Yeah, thank you, brah. That was, ladies and gentlemen, Sifiso Skenjana. We just spoke about SONA, and you heard what some of the valuable sort of thoughts he had around that, and then sort of the way that the thinking. If the thinking could shift, there's a lot that the country can actually do, and have a much more progressive sort of state of affairs, as it were, than we actually have at the particular moment. Spoky.
Yeah, I also think because I was going to ask a question about the coalition in terms of, the, government moving forward. And obviously there has to be strategies in place, because in the municipalities, it's definitely not working. It is not as seamless as we'd expect it to be, because when they have those negotiations amongst, the different parties, we have this perception that when they go out now, they're there to make sure things are happening. Those things that they negotiated and on who is going to be supporting what doesn't filter through to the lived experiences of the people. So definitely, I do agree with him where he says that there has to be strategies put in place in order for the coalitions to work. Yes, there will be, some disorder in the beginning, but there has to be, because when it comes to national government, it's at a more bigger scale than the local government, because local government, you can always kind of get away with it because it's in the small towns, it's in the other provinces, but national, it's a different can of worms, if I can put it like that. So it's going to be interesting, looking at coalitions at the national level.
Yeah, I think though, I mean, part of what would be meaningful is really accepting when we are in that coalition, accept that this is the situation now, and we've seen a lot of fights, not accepting that that's the situation, and people need to follow in that type of mind as and when they get into
Yeah.
that space. So I think that's where some of the problems come in. But again, they turn the land to Bakalana because also it
Yes.
helps clean up those municipalities. And try and get to be cleaner and cleaner as the time goes on. But ladies and gentlemen, yeah, that's what we had just discussed. And don't forget, we're coming back, live on Facebook and on YouTube. Our beautiful couple is coming. The Lottos are going to be here in the studio, and we are just going to celebrate love and speak to what their situation is. So now, Spooky, current affairs.
Yes.
Or you want to do a song, then we come back.
Let's do a song, then we come
Okay.
back just to give our
Yeah, because
breather.
when we come back, guys, it's just going to be right through here on Facebook. We're not gonna take a breather. So let me just two songs so that you guys can have a breather. Uhambe uyophunga ikofi yakho if uzawuphunga. If drink yakho empty, fill it up right now as we take a break by playing you some beautiful